God's mercy and grace be upon you, friends. The Hebrew writer begins his letter this way. God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed, heir of all things, by whom he made all the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. There is so much right there in just those first opening verses. This letter, the letter to the Hebrews, is a fantastic letter, my friends. And it is, in my opinion, it is one of the key epistles that helps us understand the Bible and how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament. It helps us understand how it is that God, in his plan which he predestined before the founding of the world, how he would redeem man, how it is that he was able to transition through the patriarchal system into the Mosaic system, and then how it all transitioned into the Christian system, the gospel under Jesus Christ. It really is a fabulous letter. And I'm sure it's a letter that you have read, but if you have not, my friend, I truly encourage you to take the time to read it, to really ponder it, and it will help you tremendously with your understanding of the way that God's plan works together, and specifically the Old and the New Testament, the division between the two, the Mosaic system and the New Covenant system. I know it was for me. It was a book that I had never really read. I knew some verses from it, but decades now ago, whenever I sat down and I read it, for the first time, I was 17 years old when I first read this book. Read this book, changed my life. It absolutely changed my life. And it still changes my life to this day. And I mean, you just see it, those first few verses right there, how there's so much that the Hebrew writer packs into everything that he has to say to his audience. And just the fact that he describes here the last days and how it is that the last days began in the first century. And are we in the last days now? You better believe it. They were then too. And where is Jesus Christ right now? Well, he's sitting on the right hand of God the Father Almighty, right? The majesty on high. So much to be said in all of that. What the Hebrew writer then goes on and does, though, whenever he is writing to these particular Christians, I mean, why is it called the Hebrews? Why is it called the letter of the Hebrews? I mean, in fact, isn't he supposed to be talking to Christians? I mean, well, he is. But he's talking to Christians who were Jewish converts primarily. I'm not going to say exclusively, but primarily. These were Christians who came out of Judaism. They came out of the Mosaic system. They had come to accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah, the prophet that Moses himself had prophesied of so long ago back in Deuteronomy. Whenever Moses said that there would have come a prophet that would be raised up like unto him, and he said, hear him, listen to him. And Jesus is that prophet. The Hebrew writer beautifully describes how it is then that God really took this old law, which was a shadow and a figure of things. It was a schoolmaster and a teacher, but he was able to take that use that as a forerunner to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ being the true sacrifice. No longer blood of bulls and goats and rams, but the blood of the only begotten Son of Jesus Christ, or the only begotten Son of God, that is Jesus Christ. We see that it's a better covenant, established upon better promises, with a better sacrifice. It's all better, my friends, which is because of Jesus. It's a fantastic book. Now, why is the Hebrew writer writing this? Why is he writing this to Christians? Again, these are Christians, but these are Christians who have been converted out of Judaism. Why do they need to hear about it? Well, because there was a temptation for them to go back. There was a temptation for them, though, that now they had become Christians, and they were enjoying the joy and the peace which God gave his people. There was a temptation, though, to go back into the old system. Why? Well, we have to, of course, as far as the exact why, The Hebrew writer doesn't tell us expressly what all these individuals were thinking, but we can, I think, read between the lines a bit and get an understanding of why it is that the old way would have been tempting for them. First of all, if you just consider for a moment the world in which they lived. I mean, you imagine growing up in a world in which your whole system, right, you have been taught and told that this is the way to worship God. And you've been taught and you've been told for your youth up and for generations of your family, this is how God is to be worshipped. We are God's people. And these are the signs in which we know that we are God's people. Those being circumcision, right? And your whole world and your whole system of life is revolving around that. I mean, everything, your job, of course, where you go and you worship, but your whole community, where you go to shop, right, for your groceries and everything, your friends, your neighbors, your schools, the whole community. And now, all of that changes. And now you have come to know and understand something. That is that old law, that old system that God had given through Moses was now no longer in effect. It had, in fact, faded away. And that's exactly what Moses had said would happen. Now, how about that? But then here now is this moment where you come to realize that now, not only has this system now faded away, but it's faded away within my lifetime. Jesus Christ has come, and the old law has been nailed to the cross, as Paul puts it, to the Colossians. But you see now, since there is a fulfillment, since Jesus came and He fulfilled the law, now He has come to establish a new covenant. And it's one that, the prophets actually always testified of, didn't they? It's a law now written on the hearts of men, not on tables of stone. It's now just like now Jesus, you've come to learn what Jesus teaches. Jesus taught it's no longer about which mountain you worship God in, right? It's not this mountain or that mountain or here or there, but it's about worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And God no longer dwelling in some holy temple, but He's dwelling in our hearts. He is our God and we are His people. And then coming to the great realization that this invitation of the gospel now is not exclusive to just me and my friends and neighbors and people that are of this certain bloodline, but it's for everybody. You can imagine how this is totally, their world is being turned upside down with this. And everything's fine as long as everybody, if the people that are in your life that you love, if they believe that too. But what do you do whenever you have family members, you have neighbors, you have others that they don't agree? And not only they don't agree on, this isn't the way you should worship God, but they see it as Jesus is of the devil. You realize that Jesus was a blasphemer for many of these Jews. In fact, you remember that they accused Him of actually getting His power from the devil, because He was able to cast out demons. Well, if He's able to cast out demons, He must be the master of all demons. And so now you're at odds with your family and your friends, and it's affecting your whole walk of life. And you may have to move, get a different job. Kids can't go to school there anymore. And where are you going to go and live now? You can't just go to the next town over where there's another Jewish community and just go fit in there, because you're going to run into the same issue. So now you're going to go live with the Gentiles now? These people now that you have for so long have been taught, they're just unclean and pagan and everything. And let's not be coy about this or have a false idea here. It's not like that all of the Gentiles are clamoring to come to Jesus either. There's plenty of paganism going on still there. And the pagans themselves who were converted to Christ had their own issues to deal with. How many times do we read about the Apostle Paul being run out on a rail and he's being stoned to the point of death and left? And he's on a run for his life constantly, because people are trying to kill him. That included Gentiles trying to kill him. So where do you go now? Where do you go? And your life now is topsy-turvy. And how is this going to end? And how is this going to change? There are so many, in many ways, there's so many unanswered questions for you now. And you can take it for a while. Just as like any, God has made us very resilient. You know that. He's made us very resilient. We can live in, just physically, He's made it where we can live in the Saharan desert, or we can live in Antarctica or something, Not easily, but still, we're clever people and we can figure out ways. He's made it where we can endure disease and death, and we can endure hardship, we can endure economic distress, we can endure a lot, actually. But then there starts to come to a point where you start to ask yourself, is it really worth it anymore? Can I continue to endure? Part of what makes you able, you consider for just a moment. Whenever you've gone through difficult parts of your life, we've all been through a difficult, how long now? 15, what was it? How many weeks turn into how many months now? And dealing with our own personal trials, health issues of ourselves or loved ones, death, economic distress. What's helped see you through just those difficult times? Part of it has been surely your family, friends, people that you love, right? Your hope. Right? That's ultimately where this is getting to, right? Your hope. But then what if you didn't have those people to rely on like you once did before? And again, for a lot of these early Christians here, we have so many advantages for them compared to them. They had advantages too that we don't have. Many of them were eyewitnesses to some of these events, or they actually were able to sit and speak to the Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul, right? They had that advantage, and they were able to witness miracles and things, but they didn't have the New Testament written down. They didn't have all of it like we do, and they did not have the examples like we do. They had their own examples, but we have the examples of people like this that we can go back to. My point is that there were new trails being blazed here by our Christian forefathers. And it was not easy for these people to then become a child of God, to follow Jesus Christ, and to stay the course. And as we were getting back to a moment ago, you can endure for a while, but then there comes to a point where you start to ask yourself, is it worth it? Can I endure? And it could be tempting to just throw your hands up and say, I give up. It'd be just easier just to go back. And you could delude yourself into thinking, well, I'm going back to the Jewish way, but I'm not really going to be serving like as a Jew. I'm going to be doing it in name only. But in my heart, I'll still serve Jesus. You could imagine that sort of mindset that they would have. And the Hebrew writer is having to fight that mindset. That's really what the letter is about, is he's having to fight that mindset and that temptation to want to go back. Whether it is because of hardship and temptation and tribulation because of their faith, which they were experiencing. James deals with this as well. Or it could be also it's a temptation to want to go back because, these were traditions and they harken back to your youth and they harken back to good old times and they harken back to some things that you just kind of enjoyed doing. That could be a temptation for you to want to slide back. That also certainly could be a temptation just to appeal to our human nature in the sense that we like physical things. We like box checking. That was never to be the point of the old law, but it had become that for the Jews. Christianity in many ways is easier for us. The load is easy, the burden is light. Christ bears it with us, and we don't have to go through this box checking sort of scenario, if you will. But in other ways, it is more difficult. It would be, they could go back to that. It'd be a temptation to want to go back to that. And don't think that temptation hasn't gone away. I just want to say that for just a moment too, is that you realize there is a renewed and increased interest right now in going back to the old law. Torah-observant Christians, right? You've heard of them perhaps, and sometimes you'll see some of these buildings, but that's becoming more popular. Christians, modern-day Christians, Gentile Christians observing the feast days and things like that, right? The Feast of the Tabernacles, the Passover feast, and things like that. It's becoming more popular. And the Hebrew writer's fighting that and showing us how it is that if you go back to that, what you're giving up so much. You're giving up things that are far greater and far better, and you're giving it up for something that is lesser and something that has been done away with. But I digress a bit on a separate topic. The point I'm really wanting to get back to tonight is this dealing with a difficult sort of scenario and situation, and how do you endure when it seems like there is no end to the conflict or no end to the strife, and it doesn't look like days are going to get easier for you. And part of what the Hebrew writer does here for these Christians is he not only argues to them from an intellectual standpoint that, hey, it doesn't make sense for you to go back to this. So he appeals to their intellect in that way, but he also appeals to their heart with this idea of hope and how it is that they must cling to hope. Otherwise, they will not make it. And I suppose after that long introduction, that's really what I'm trying to get to tonight, is looking at this idea of hope and how it is that hope is what sees us through. That's part of what's helped see us through in difficult times. The past year and a half, or so, is that just having some hope helps us get through difficulty. You can endure as long as you have hope. You can endure as long as you have some real expectation that times will get better, or that there is some reward at the end. It will be worth it all. When your hopes are dashed, or whenever the hope begins to diminish, then your will diminishes and you simply can't go on anymore. You lose the will to fight and the will to live, and you just want to give up. And the Hebrew writer is telling them, don't give in to that. You see, the devil wants to destroy your hope. The devil does not want you to think that it's worth it. He doesn't want you to think that it will ever end. He doesn't want you to think that there is any good to come of it, and that you're just wasting all of your time, efforts, and energy. But again, that's a lie from the father of lies. And what the Hebrew writer describes for us here in these few verses that were read for us just a moment ago is how it is that hope is what? Our anchor. Again, I just want to read those two verses, that the little section for us here again to reemphasize it, where he says here in verse 18, says that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. Which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both steadfast, sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. There's actually a lot being said there, but just that I'll simply put right now, that idea of that hope is our anchor. It's what moors you, it's what keeps you steadfast. The Hebrew writer uses this image here of like the ship on the sea, right? I have in my mind, I picture it like a ship, obviously within a storm, but like at night, right? You can't see anything, and it's just the waves. And forget about radar, forget about GPS, forget about any sort of cell phones or anything like that, or Doppler radar or whatever, or radio, and you're just out there and you're just enduring that storm. You don't know when it's going to end. You don't know when the next wave is going to come. And you're rocking along there and it's dark and you don't know which way to go. What's going to hold you in all of that? Because you see, whenever we are without God, it's like we're that ship in that sea, in the dark, without guidance, without GPS or anything like that. And the devil is throwing all of these things at us, and his whole point and objective is to do what? Sink your ship and throw you off course. He's trying to destroy you. You realize that. What's going to see you through the storm And how in the world can you endure? And here's the thing, we must get in our minds is that whenever we come to Christ, it is not a life of ease. I remember this one time I had this conversation with a young man. This was in Oklahoma, and I was standing outside. He's my neighbor across the street. We were standing in the ditch, right? We have huge ditches there. I hated mowing those stinking ditches. That's one thing I'm thankful for here. I got ditches, but nothing like what I had before. But we would sit there and we were talking, and that's what he was telling me, is that why it is that he just simply could not come back to God. He said, because it seems like whenever I come to God, life gets harder. It doesn't get easier. And it's actually easier when I don't serve Him. Of course, we had a long conversation about that. My point is that mindset, though, that we can deceive ourselves into thinking that it's somehow just going to be and it's not going to be an easier life. I mean, in fact, Jesus tells us and prepares us that we must count the cost, because God does not promise us a life then in which it's just smooth sailing from here on out. What He does promise us, my friends, is the fact that we will have some compass out there, that we will have some GPS, if you will. We will have some bearings about us, and we will have a hope that will anchor us. Because we know that in the end, God has all of this. He's our pilot. He's our captain. The world just deceives people into thinking that what they have to offer is smooth sailing, because they don't. The world does not have that to offer. It is very tumultuous and reckless, and it does destroy people. You see, it's going to be a storm either way. It's just, do you want to be in the storm with reality, in which you have something that's really anchoring you and it's really telling you the truth? Or do you want to be in the storm, which is a real storm, but what the world has to offer you is it's toys. It's deception. It's not real. To try to make you think that you know where you're going and what you're doing. Right? Because the world's going to provide you with a compass. The world's going to provide you with its own GPS, its own maps and everything, and it's going to look all glitzy and great and wondrous and all of that and flashy and such, but it's all lies. It is all lies, and it does not tell you at all where you are and where you need to be, and the anchor that they provide you is shoddy and it doesn't work. God is the only one that's going to provide you something that's going to be lasting, is going to actually help you through it. The thing about God's Word, though, is that God's going to tell you straight how it is, and that's not always pleasant. He's not about scratching your itching ears and making you feel comfortable. He's about telling you the truth because He's in the business of saving your soul. Not making you happy temporarily. So we have to have this hope. That's what the Hebrew writer is describing here. If you want to make it, you have to have your hope. And your hope must be placed in God. In fact, as he described it there, God is the one in which we have fled to find refuge. Refuge to lay hold upon the hope that is set before us. Now, what he does here in helping us understand what it means to have this hope in God and what it really means to endure is he gives us a wonderful example of a man of faith and a man of true hope, and that is Abraham. Our father Abraham, right there. That was a moment for me too. Whenever I was a really young man, as a teenager, was realizing what it meant. That I was a child of Abraham. We grew up. I remember as a kid, little bitty kid, we'd sing that song. Father Abraham has many sons. I'm one of them. So are you. Never thought about that. I just liked the song. It was fun. And it dawned on me that whenever I was a teenager, it's like, oh, I'm a child of Abraham. But how am I a child of Abraham? I'm not a Jew. It's because he's the father of faith. I'm a child of faith. That's how it works, right? That was a light bulb moment for me, right? When Paul writes that and describes that. But he points to Father Abraham, right? Which Abraham's important to everybody. And he points to Abraham as the one who really is a wonderful example of patience and hope and faith. Because here you have Abraham, and let's just back up in verse 13. He says, "For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, saying, Surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise." Now you remember the story of Abraham. God called Abraham out of what? He called him out of his homeland, right? His homeland was all full of paganism. And God called him out of that. And he says, I want you to go into this other land of paganism, but I want you to go into this wilderness. I want you to walk around. You're going to wander around. I'm going to give you this land. The point is right there. You already see with Abraham the sacrifice that he made and the faith that he had just in the fact that he left when God said, come, leave, and I'm going to be with you. Abraham believed him, and Abraham went. And part of what's so amazing about that is there was no Abraham for Abraham to look to, but Abraham did it. You understand what I'm saying? Trailblazer. We owe a lot to our forefathers of faith. We really do. And we perhaps don't always recognize how much we really owe them. Right? God chose some good men and women to help us understand, to bring about his promise, but also give us good examples. But Abraham left. He showed his faith in that. You remember whenever God then gave his promise back in Genesis to Abraham about how he would bless him, he would have a name, he would have a son, right, a family, and he'd have land, right? God would give him all of this. And when God, and this is back in Genesis chapter 12, whenever all of this begins, right? He does it in Genesis 12, he does it in Genesis, reiterates it in Genesis 15, and then you have it again then in Genesis chapter 22. But what you have, God promising to Abraham, okay, let's just take the nation and the son, the family. How many children did Abraham have at that point? He had 0, no children. How old were he and his wife? They were old, right? Right? My apologies. 75 years old, though, whenever it was made, right? Right? But he was 75 years old. And God said, you're going to have children. I mean, so many, in fact, your descendants are going to be so innumerable. It's like the stars or in the sky or the sand on the seashore. Right? Abraham believed it. 75 years old, right? And his wife was right on his heels, too. When did God finally give him a son? He was 100 years old. 25 years. No, I mean, that's a long time to wait. 25 years. And, God's not speaking to Abraham every night. You know that. It's not like every night whenever Abraham is laying down or every time Abraham wakes up, God's like, all right, Abraham, just remember, just hold on, I'm going to keep my promise. He told it to Abraham. You got, 3 instances that I could count right now, really. And these are spread out. Or he tells Abraham, I'm going to do this for you. And Abraham then, as the patriarch, and they only spoke to Abraham. He didn't speak to all the other ones. Abraham, as the patriarch, is now having to lead his family and convince his family and tell his family, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And you understand the conviction that Abraham has to have to be able then to lead his whole family out like this. And how strong his faith must be and his resolve and his patience and his endurance must be to wait that long. To even begin then the process of seeing God begin to fulfill this promise of having a son. 25 years. He's 100 years old whenever he has a son. You understand then a little more of why he and Sarah mess up like they do with Ishmael and Hagar. Right? It wasn't only that Abraham had to wait on. It wasn't as if Abraham really got to see the full fulfillment of the land promise of it. He only got to see the beginning of it. That whole time of wandering around, I mean, he was, for the most part, a nomad. It's not like he came into this land and he, laid down roots and then he had his, 40 acres on a mule. Well, that was nothing, but, he had his big spread there and that was it. And he could just enjoy. He was a nomad for most part, wandering around in that land. But God had promised you're going to have this land. And Abraham never doubted it. The point is that you see with Abraham, how is it that he could have endured like that? And you read the story of Abraham, and it wasn't as if his life, he was certainly blessed, but there was certainly, it was not an easy life that he had while he was wandering around. But yet he endured. And then at the end of it all, of course, the great test of his faith is whenever finally he gets this son and he's raising him up. And then God says, all right, I want you to sacrifice him. And he'd waited so long for that boy, didn't he? The endurance and the faith that he has is amazing. What was it that able to see Abraham through? It was his hope. In fact, we're told that Abraham hoped for what? A city not made with hands. He hoped for a city that God had built. So right there, that tells you whenever Abraham was, when he's looking at it, at hope, whenever he describes his hope, what was he looking toward? It was not really about this life and at the immediate. He was always looking ahead. He was always looking ahead. And Abraham did not fall into the trap, for the most part, of having his own expectation of how God would fulfill this command, or his promise rather, that how God would fulfill his promise to him, or when he would do it. Abraham let God do it in his own time, for the most part. That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. So the Hebrew writer uses Abraham as this excellent example to these, again, primarily Jewish converts, Christians, right, who are formerly Jewish that are coming into the new system, this Christian dispensation, that are now being tempted to go back because they're having to endure persecution, difficult times, all of it. And he points to Abraham. Abraham had that hope and he was able to see beyond. And he points to the fact that why is it that Abraham could believe in this? Is because he trusted God ultimately. And he points to God's nature and how it is that God cannot lie. Wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, that is, the unchangeableness of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. Of course, the oath that God gave, what could he swear by? He couldn't swear by anything but himself, because there's nothing greater than himself. And so he swore by himself that this would happen, and it did. And the Hebrew writer says that by two immutable things, unchangeable things, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation who have fled to refuge, to lay hold upon the hope set before us, which is this anchor. And as he goes on, he says about this hope, and here's a whole other layer for you. He says, both sure and steadfast, which entereth into that within the veil. What's that reference to? That's the veil in the temple, the Holy of Holies, right? The mercy seat, where it is to be found, where God dwells. And so the hope, what's the hope here? The hope is Jesus, you see. Jesus is the one who's able to enter into the veil, right? He's the high priest. And as he goes on and he says in verse 20, whither the forerunner is for us entered, even Jesus, made an high priest after the order of Melchizedek, which Melchizedek was that unique priest that Abraham had contact with back in Genesis. There was no other priest like him. He had no forerunner. He had no follower, right? But Abraham paid homage to him. And Abraham, who was greater than Levi, because Levi was yet within his loins, it's argued, he paid homage to him. And so the Melchizedekian priesthood is superior to the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood of Aaron, or the priesthood of Levi. That's you see the part of the logic he's giving here. And the beauty of God's plan. That's a whole other lesson. But the point is that we have Jesus as our hope, who has entered into that region beyond the veil. And he is the one advocating on our behalf. So, my friend, what sees us through, the Hebrew writer tells us right here, for these Christians right here, it's like, okay, how are you going to endure in all of this? You have to lay your hope on Jesus. And if you try to sacrifice your hope on Jesus for something else, you're not going to endure and you're not going to make it. That's part of what helps us get through to the end. We mentioned already, whenever we get through hard times and difficult times, is that what helps us, our loved ones, our relationships, right? We all naturally fall back on the things that kind of give us security, right? You fall back on the plans that you've made, right? Your nest egg, things like that, right? Your prepping and all of that. Right? What do you do when that gives out, right? We have loved ones, people you can fall back into. But what if you don't have your loved ones anymore, right? What if they're taken away from you? What do you have? You see, all of those other elements are important and they're there to help us. But you see very quickly why it is that your ultimate hope has to always go back to Jesus Christ. Because when those things are taken away, say you're carted off. You and your family, blindfolded, you're carted off, and you're all separated in train cars, and you're taken at opposite ends of the country, and you're put in concentration camps, and you're separated from your loved ones and your family. What are you going to do now? The hope has to lie on Jesus to make it through to the end, my friends. And it's not even extreme examples like that. Just being able to get through the humdrum of life and the storms and the waves of life that just everyday life has to throw at you, which just wears on you. It wears you down. Jesus has to be the thing that you ultimately go back to in the end that gives you hope. Otherwise, you will not make it. Flee to Him for refuge, to lay hold upon the hope that is set before you. And let that be the anchor of your soul, which is both sure and steadfast. Realizing and remembering that God cannot lie, and He will fulfill His promise. And so you look to someone like Abraham. Look at the patience of Abraham. Surely I can wait like that. And surely I can look toward and look beyond the horizon to see that city not made with hands and realize that ultimately the hope that I have is not about this life, but it's about something else. One thing I've come to appreciate more and more, this is just a side point for you, is everything, every walk of life that we have, every season of life, and everything that comes our way, it is a moment in which your faith is either going to flourish and be made stronger, or it's going to be made weaker. It's a moment in which you're either going to utilize it for the glory of God, and it's going to catapult you toward ultimately heaven, or you're going to backslide into despair. And it doesn't matter. If you are in a time in which you are extremely blessed, you can in those times use those blessings and such just to fulfill your selfish indulgences, and then you can just fatten your hearts as in the day of slaughter, as James says, and you just backslide off into misery in the end and set you up for an eternity of misery. Or you can use those moments of blessing, and you can use the talents that God has given you, the blessings that God has given you for His glory, and it can propel you forward and help you appreciate God so much more. But the same is true for the difficult times that come, in which things now are taken away. You could use that as an opportunity to become angry and resentful and vengeful and furious or afraid and worrisome now. And then that you backslide and slide off into that despair. And your faith is weakened. Or you see this and you see what an opportunity God has presented before me. How it is that God is working His wonders through this difficulty in my life. And it makes your faith stronger. Try to have that mindset, my friends, whenever you see these difficulties and whenever you see these blessings in your life as those moments in which your faith is going to either be made stronger or weaker, and see the opportunity in which God can work through that and make your life better and make your faith stronger, right? When I say life better, I don't necessarily mean your lifestyle, but I mean your peace and your joy and ultimately your relationship with Him and your relationship with your fellow Christians, and how it points you toward that city not made with hands. Because that's what Abraham was always looking toward in the end. And that's what's amazing too. I mean, he promised him a nation, he promised him land, he promised him a reputation, but what did Abraham ultimately want? He wanted to be in heaven with God, the city not made with hands. Let that be said of us too. My dear friend, if tonight is a night that you wish to lay hold upon the anchor of your soul, the hope, Jesus Christ, the righteous, you can be baptized for the remission of your sins tonight. He entered in that veil on your behalf. He's there to offer up sacrifice for you right at the mercy seat. Make petition on your behalf before God Almighty, sitting at the right hand of the throne of God. If you want to have that this evening, be baptized for the remission of your sins, you need the prayers of the congregation. Won't you come as we sing?